and I really appreciate these talks so far. I appreciate Matt's framing with his lead questions, and I'd say two of those apply most to what I've got here. Number one, actually, I am interested in the liberal arts. Number two, what is history? So I'd like to consider two Roman authors. Why do one when you can do two? I originally had three. I've actually cut one back. But these are Seneca the Younger and St. Augustine, both of whom you'll know. Today, as I said, I'm going to approach both in terms of the history of the liberal arts because, A, the discipline of history is an offspring of those arts. Put it more provocatively, and as has already been hinted about, especially in Matt's paper, there's not necessarily any such thing as history per se in this time. We can come back to that. And B, whatever the authors do say specifically about Historia tends to be couched in conversations more broadly about the liberal arts and learning. I've taken then a somewhat literal approach on that very first question, what is history? And it ends up with forcing us to look at it through a taxonomy of histories. That's sort of what the slide is hinting at. You'll know some of these references. The second inquiry investigation is the locus classicus for history coming from Herodotus. But actually there's one behind that, come to find out. It's a noun, it's also a verb. It's histor, not only historia, and it's also historien. I just mentioned this to give a hint of the complications that we run into if we're thinking about the history of history. My point is not to give a taxonomy here. The point is to say the history of history, like the history of the arts, is complicated. The liberal arts, for example, not a simple sequence. We know the basics. There came to be 7. That actually wasn't until the 6th century, probably, even into the 7th century in some cases. We know they were adopted by the Romans from the Greeks. They're calling them artes liberales, which is a Latin phrase that does in fact appear most famously in Cicero. An older scholar said Cicero uses it, that should be enough. So we can talk about the liberal arts that way. But the list, there was no such thing as a canon. That list changed over time. It could even vary not only among different authors, but even in an author. So you take a Roman imperial author like, or during the Roman Empire, an author like the great Philo, his lists vary anywhere from 3 arts to 6 at various times. So it's all very unsettled. I used the word complex earlier. It's quite unsettled, but that makes it interesting to me. So to start briefly with Seneca, another basic thing that the 3 of us do and that you all do in the classroom, obviously, with history in particular, is to contextualize. I had heard of the one letter I'm going to cite here, just called uncreatively number 88, of his moral epistles. But number 88 I'd read, but I made it through graduate school without really hearing it contextualized. So that's to encourage that sort of reading. It answered, I understood the basics of the letter, but one of the things that comes across in this letter is that Seneca is grumpy. Somebody said earlier that, when you start to think, when you have high hopes for virtue in your society, you tend to end up disappointed, and that's where Seneca is. But I'd read quite a bit about Seneca, a little about Nero, and I'd never really heard about connecting the dots. Well, why is he so angry? Why is he so darn near despondent? And I think you can make a case. I'm not going to build the entire thing here, but I think it just comes down to his biography. Here's a few notes. He's Spanish. His father was famous. Both his brothers were more or less famous, one of whom appears in the book of Acts in the New Testament as a governor in the East. He's a Stoic philosopher. Most people understand that about Seneca. A relative late comer to come to the Roman elite that is in the city of Rome itself. But when he does, he starts to move up the ladder really quickly. But by 49, he's been expelled from Rome, suspected of adultery with the sister of the Emperor Claudius. The good news is that he's brought back. in AD 49 because of the good graces of a woman called Agrippina, which is also the bad news, because she's going to give him his next job, which is to tutor her son, the young Emperor Nero. He was still a teenager when he came to power, and he remained under Seneca's tutelage for some time. Judging by one of Seneca's early works, basically a present for the new emperor is called On Mercy or De Clementia. And he clearly, from that work, had high hopes for the young ruler, as many Romans seemed to, even among the traditionally skeptical senatorial class. Seneca prescribes mercy or clemency as the most important virtue for a ruler. But De Clementia was composed within 2 to 3 months of the first murder inside Nero's palace. His stepbrother was killed at age 13, mysterious circumstances. In 54, some 4 years later, Nero had commissioned the murder of his mother by a boating accident. Seneca was in self-imposed exile for the last few years of his life, unable, sort of trapped, unable morally to work for his boss. But his boss had, so to speak, made him an offer he couldn't refuse. He was frozen. He couldn't officially retire. He couldn't move without, say, a day's journey from Rome. He also couldn't end his life. Of course, Stoicism allowed for some concept of a noble suicide. He couldn't do that for his family's sake. So it was really only in 65, finally, when he's, 65, that is, when he's basically given the green light that he can take himself out, he does so. So what you're seeing in the letters is to some extent a leadership crisis, and it brings up the question about where virtue fits in leadership and where our expectation should be where virtue is concerned for leadership. Has anybody seen hints of that topic on social media lately? So the disappointment is there. Let's look at the very beginning of this letter quickly. Liberal studies are the first 2 words of the epistle, and within the first few lines, they also hint at the author's wider disposition towards education in general. You could go so far as to entitle this letter Seneca Against the Liberal Arts, because they're just not enough. He says, I don't respect any study or count it among good activities if it results in a profit. These crafts, useful if they prepare the mind and do not distract it. One should linger in these as long as the mind cannot do anything greater. They're our elementary training, but not our real work. You see, while they're called liberal, because they're worthy of free man, but only one study is truly liberal, one that makes him free, sapientia, wisdom, aka philosophy. The rest of the arts are puny, puerile. Do you think there's anything good in these arts which teachers use seem to be the most shameful and scandalous of all men? We ought not to learn these things, but to have learned them. There are some who've judged that we should ask whether liberal arts make a man good. But these other teachers don't even pretend that. Finally, grammar, he says, is preoccupied with care for speech, and if it wants to spread further about histories and to extend the boundaries to the limit, to poetry. Which of these lays a path toward virtue? So there you've got that Aristotelian relationship between poetry and history. There's quite a bit happening in this first passage. That's probably more distracting than not, but there's the whole thing in case you wanted it. I know that's too much text. It's certainly a high view of liberal learning to some extent, in the sense that the liberal arts here are fit for a free man. This is, in modern terms, the university as a place where nothing useful is taught. It's elite, not to say snobbish. But it's also a pretty good snapshot of where things stand educationally in circa 60 CE or so. We've got grammar, music, geometry, astronomy, and then he makes a point of excluding later in the letter, painting, statuary, or making statues, that is, and athletics. I'll come back to this in a second. The second interesting thing is that he's participating in teacher bashing, availing himself to a time-honored tradition that Thucydides, Xenophon, everyone would have understood, no doubt familiar to Plato as well. See, it's ambiguous because it's an insider's critique of this learning. This is a man who's had this education, criticizing that education, but ambiguous/ironic because he's assuming that education is still going to continue after his time has passed. But to return to the outline here, obviously it's interesting to me that Historia is a species of the grammar genus, so to speak. Another book I've run into really in preparation for this talk that another thing I missed during graduate school was Gerald Press's book, The Development of the Idea of History and Antiquity, is amazing. Pretty brief, a bit dense, but really amazing. He doesn't talk about Seneca in this letter, but he does bring up a grammarian Dionysius Thrax, an Alexandrian who flourished in the 2nd century BC, who also links history to something like grammar. This is the sixfold appearance of grammar as defined by Dionysius. Turns out Dionysius, it's a short handbook on grammar, and it was widely popular from the Hellenistic period well into the imperial period, kind of a standard work. You can see prosody, exegesis, glossae, etymology, analogies, and the highest art, criticism of poetic productions. Again, that relationship. But he likens in the original this gloss or glosses to Historia. It's basically a synonym there, which is interesting. That's picked up, I'm arguing, not necessarily directly from Dionysius in Seneca's later letter about a similar topic. So here we've got a gloss of unfamiliar person, places, or events. We've also got an entry of something like a subject of history into Western civilization, not as a discipline, but as information about various matters in whatever literature one studied. This is obviously not our history. In fact, searching for history in Seneca can be frustrating for anyone hoping for a familiar, less than ill-defined definition. In fact, no field yet existed. There's nevertheless reason to bear our history in mind while reading ancient authors if no historical discipline is delineated by Seneca or Augustine, as we'll see in a second. Some things that will become distinctive characteristics of it are certainly present. Let me give you a few examples from the letter. Consider the questions that are asked by Seneca. These are all, by the way, not worth of the philosopher's time, he's saying, but that doesn't matter to my argument. Things like, who is older, Homer or Hesiod? What's the route of Odysseus' wanderings? Would you have me unroll the annal of the world's histories and try to find out who first wrote poetry? Or shall I make an estimate of the number of years which lie between Orpheus and Homer? This is, I think, by our account, history. Each one of those things. So, but he's not obviously using that word, and in fact, he's also pretty cynical about them. Again, that's a separate argument. In another letter, finally, one of his theses is that each man can collect from the same source and see different things. He pictures two individuals reading the same text, Cicero's De Republica. The one is a philologist, that's the Latin in Seneca, and the other is a grammaticus given to philosophy, so it's kind of a sophisticated teacher. The philosopher, or this grammaticus, wonders that so much could have been said against justice. The philologist, on the other hand, takes up the same book and comments as follows. and I'll run through this quickly, but it proves the same point. There were two Roman kings, one without a father and one without a mother. We can't settle who Servius's mother was. The philologist also notes that the officer whom we call dictator, and about whom we read in our histories under that title, was named in old times the Magister Populi. Such is the name existing today in the augural records. He will remark, too, that Romulus met his end during an eclipse, that there was an appeal to the people, even from the kings, etc., etc. History by 21st century standards. He continues, when the Grammaticus unrolls the same volume, he puts down his notebook in the forms of words, making what we would call etymological or philological notes. So again, we're back to these complications. Here, his Grammaticus has turned into our philologist. It's really frustrating to read. It's a headache. But it illustrates that fluid, unsettled state of categories where history among any given discipline is. It's also an advertisement for learning Latin, because even in going back over these letters, the translations differ. And if you're thinking about subject in particular, for example, the more recent translation mentions the subject of history, but in the Latin, it's simply ea, the thing that's called history, which is arguably not the subject, right? For a minute, I thought my argument here that there's no such thing as history was undermined, but the Latin says no such thing. To move briefly to Augustine, two stepping spots for him. The most significant work of historiography from his corpus is, of course, the City of God. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk instead about two snippets, one from De Ordine, or On Order, a book he wrote shortly after converting, pre-baptism, in something like 386, and to his De Doctrina Christiana, which, like the grammar I mentioned earlier, was hugely popular into the medieval period. So halfway through De Ordine, first of all, he too, like Seneca in his letter, Augustine gives a nice little chapter and picture, a snapshot, I guess, of the lay of the land. He includes grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, music, and geometry. There is a sixth, which he calls astrology in the Latin, which of course subsumes our astronomy as well. He'll make the distinction between those two pretty forcefully in De Doctrina Christiana 10 years later. All these things can be good, Augustine says, but one of the things he's wrestling with over the course of his long career is the relationship a convert should have to all of this learning, and I'm not going to go into that in detail. I assume both his biography and his approach to that question are fairly familiar to you. But I will say that about 10 years later, we've got De Doctrina Christiana, which is something like a manual. There's a lot has been written about how exactly to think about this work. I've heard it reads like something like what we'd find in a seminary today or in a divinity school. But there's scholars out there who said he actually has students, even adolescents, in mind. That we don't need to go into that, but the audience is a question. The point was there is always a large audience. But this too has some really significant thinking about learning, but also history in particular. He doesn't list disciplines in De Doctrina Christiana, and his argument is actually a little bit harder to follow, arguably, than it had been in De Ordine. But he does have sections on grammar, history, rhetoric, and, quote, number. He also includes knowledge that falls under our natural science, plants, rocks, animals, astronomy, zoology, etc. But by the middle of the second of the four books, it's pretty clear that Augustine is taking some positive stance or open stance towards pagan learning, despite his recent conversion. It would be foolish, he says, for the Christian to reject the alphabet because of its ancient associations with Mercury, nor should justice or virtue be spurned because pagans had dedicated temples to each of them. A person who's a good and true Christian should realize that truth belongs to his Lord wherever it is found, gathering and acknowledging it even in pagan literature. This culminates in his famous "it spoils of the Egyptians" motif. He didn't invent, but he breathed life into it in that work. Okay, to finish up, on the short section on history in Augustine, he says, anything then that we learn from history about the chronology of the past. Sorry, I can't work this wheel. Is very useful for the interpretation of Scripture. To make a long story short, with Augustine in this work in particular, as in Seneca's letter, history was a species of grammar. In Augustine, it's a species of rhetoric, as you will know if you've read, especially The City of God, but several of his work. It's apology, apologetics, it's exegesis, it's a defense of his faith, it's a bank, it's been called, or a reservoir of proofs for the truths of Christianity, which is arguably a new use if you add the religious aspect into it. Ultimately, what we're seeing, though, is enough uses of history historically and in the ancient period, enough different meanings for it, that we can all fit in there somewhere, and we can end the pernicious myth that's called, "I'm just not a history person." Thank you.